He walked into one of the most expensive hotels in the city, wearing a jacket he'd owned for 30 years and shoes that had seen better days. And the moment he stepped through those doors, the staff made a decision about him. A fast one, the kind people make when they think they already know the answer. What they didn't know, what nobody in that lobby knew, was that the man they were turning away had quietly owned that building for decades. And what he saw that afternoon wasn't just an insult, it was evidence. And he had come prepared to use every bit of it. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The rain came down in thin, steady sheets that Tuesday afternoon, the kind that didn't pour so much as persist, quiet and relentless. It soaking through everything it touched without apology. The streets outside the Alderton Grand Hotel gleamed under it, and the doorman standing beneath the brass canopy watched the city move past with the practiced indifference of someone paid to notice certain things and ignore everything else. He noticed Elijah Carter. The old man came on foot, not from a cab, not from a town car idling at the curb. He walked up the wide stone steps with a measured pace, each step deliberate and unhurried, the way a man moves when his joints have learned the cost of rushing, but his sense of purpose has not diminished in the slightest. His shoes were dark leather, scuffed at the toes and softened by years of daily use. His jacket was the color of charcoal, thick enough against the October cold, but plain. The kind of jacket you'd find hanging in the back of a closet for decades, chosen every morning because it still fit and still worked, and not because it was meant to say anything to anyone. Beneath it, he wore a simple collared shirt, buttoned to the top, no tie. His trousers were dark and straight, pressed but not sharp. His gray hair was cut close, neat, and his face carried the particular stillness of a man who had spent a great deal of his life watching things rather than performing for them. He carried no luggage. The doorman held the door open with one hand and said nothing, offering only the mechanical courtesy his position required. Elijah stepped through without acknowledging him, not out of rudeness, but out of focus. His eyes had already moved past the entrance, on past the doorman, past the foyer with its potted orchids and its umbrella stand, and into the grand lobby beyond. The Alderton Grand was the kind of hotel that understood its own importance. The lobby ceiling rose 3 stories above the polished marble floor, capped with a vaulted skylight through which the gray afternoon light fell in muted columns, softening the edges of everything below. A chandelier hung at the center, not ostentatious, but precise, its crystal arms arranged with the kind of restraint that communicates wealth more effectively than excess ever could, each piece catching the light and releasing it in small, quiet dispersions. The furniture was deep walnut and cream upholstery. The flowers in the twin stone urns flanking the main staircase were white. The floor was pale marble veined with gray, and it caught every footstep and made it sound significant. Everything about the space said, "You are welcome here, provided you belong here." Elijah walked in and stood still for a moment. He looked up at the chandelier. He looked at the staircase, its broad carved banisters sweeping upward toward the mezzanine. His eyes moved slowly over the columns, the ceiling molding, the arrangement of the front desk along the far wall. He looked at the skylight. He looked at the floor. His expression didn't change. He took it all in with the quiet attention of a man reading something he had written a long time ago, checking whether the sentences still held. Then he walked toward the front desk. The lobby was not crowded at that hour, but it was occupied in the particular way of luxury hotels in the mid-afternoon. A couple in their 40s stood near the concierge station, studying a folded map, the woman's coat a rich camel wool, the man's watch catching the chandelier light with every gesture. 2 businessmen in fitted suits crossed the marble floor in conversation, briefcases in hand, the sound of their shoes crisp and purposeful against the stone. A family with two well-dressed children waited near the elevator bank, the father checking his phone with the relaxed certainty of someone who had already handled all the details. Nobody looked at Elijah directly, but people noticed him. The way people notice something that doesn't quite fit, not with hostility, not yet, but with the involuntary calculation that luxury environments seem to encourage in everyone who spends time in them. Eyes moved across him. Eyes moved away. A woman near the fireplace alcove glanced up from her magazine and then back down. One of the businessmen's gazes passed over him without pausing, the way you look past a piece of furniture that isn't quite where you expected it to be. Elijah noticed none of this, or rather, he noticed all of it, and it registered somewhere in the same quiet, analytical place where he was already registering everything else. He kept walking. He reached the front desk. There were two clerks on duty. One, a young man named Daniel, was working through a check-in at the far end of the counter, his attention fixed on his screen and his voice pitched low and professional. The other was Vanessa Holt. Vanessa was 32, sharp-featured, and dressed in the hotel's uniform with the precision of someone who took professional presentation as seriously as any other form of competence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a clean line. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, her hands resting lightly on the counter in front of her. She had worked the front desk at the Alderton Grand for 4 years and had developed, over that time, the particular skill of reading a lobby, of knowing within seconds who needed to be handled quickly, who needed to be impressed, who needed to be directed somewhere more appropriate, and who needed to be made to feel, gently but clearly, that they had wandered somewhere they hadn't intended. She looked at Elijah. She took him in. She made her calculation. She smiled. It was a trained smile, wide enough to read as welcoming, not wide enough to be genuine. "Good afternoon," she said. "How can I help you today?" Elijah rested both hands on the edge of the counter. His hands were large, the knuckles pronounced with age, the skin carrying the particular texture that comes from decades of work and weather and time that doesn't slow down for anyone. He settled them there with no urgency, as if he intended to stay exactly as long as he needed to. "I'd like a room," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, low without being soft. "The presidential suite, if it's available." The smile on Vanessa's face didn't disappear. It recalibrated. Something behind her eyes shifted, not a full change, just a small adjustment, the kind that happens when expectation collides with information it hadn't prepared for and needs a moment to reprocess. "The presidential suite," she repeated. "That's right." She looked at her screen. It was a brief, performative glance. She wasn't truly consulting anything. Then she looked back at him, her expression settling into something she had practiced enough times that it had become second nature. Concern layered over authority, delivered with a surface of helpfulness. "Sir, I just want to make sure you have all the right information before we proceed. The presidential suite here at the Alderton starts at $4,200 per night. That's our base rate before service charges and amenity packages." She let a small pause open between them. "We also have several beautiful standard suites that offer many of the same amenities. The views are comparable on the upper floors. And the pricing is considerably more." "I'm aware of the pricing," Elijah said. Simply. Without heat. Vanessa's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. She had encountered this before. Guests who didn't look the part insisting on the best room, sometimes because they genuinely had the means and the right to be there, and sometimes because they were testing something, proving something, simply refusing to be directed. Her instinct, shaped by 4 years inside a particular institutional culture that had sharpened considerably in the last 8 months, told her this was not a case of the former. "Of course," she said, her tone still polished. "Let me just see what we have available." She looked at her screen again, but she was not looking at anything. She was giving him space, a breath, a beat, an opportunity to hear himself and reconsider. To say something like, "Well, maybe one of the other rooms, and allow the whole thing to resolve quietly. It was a technique she used and didn't think of as a technique anymore because it had become so automatic. He didn't take the space. He simply waited, watching her with calm, steady eyes that didn't move from her face. Near the desk, a junior staff member named Patrick stood at his station, sorting welcome packets into their folders. He was 24 years old, 3 months into the job, still in the phase where everything around him was something he was trying to decode. He wasn't looking directly at the exchange, but he had stopped moving. His hands had gone still on the stack of folders. He was listening. "Sir." Vanessa's voice had changed now. The Polish was still there, but the warmth beneath it was gone, and replaced by something firmer, more certain of itself. "I don't think this hotel is within your budget. I don't want to waste either of our time." She said it as if it were a kindness, as if she were doing him a favor by saving him from embarrassment. Elijah looked at her. The look lasted long enough to be something other than a glance. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed his wallet on the counter. It was old, dark brown leather, creased deeply along the fold, the stitching worn pale at one corner, the whole object shaped by decades of being carried in the same pocket, opened and closed, slipped in and out of the same jacket every morning. It had the quality of something that had been kept rather than replaced, because the man who owned it didn't measure things by how they looked. He placed it down with care, rested his hand beside it, and met her eyes. "Just run the request," he said. His voice had not changed. It carried no anger, no wounded pride, no performance of dignity. It was the same even unhurried register it had held from the first word. But there was something in it now, something quieter than authority, but more durable, that sat beneath the surface of the words and gave them a weight she couldn't quite account for. Vanessa stared at the wallet for half a second too long. She looked up. The lobby had gotten quieter, not obviously, not dramatically, but the ambient hum had shifted. The couple near the concierge station had stopped their murmuring. The two businessmen had stilled somewhere at the edge of Elijah's peripheral vision. The space immediately around the front desk had contracted, pulling attention inward the way attention tends to when something is happening that people sense but can't yet name. "Sir." Her voice was louder now, not enough to shout, but enough to be heard clearly across the lobby, enough to establish something, a boundary, a public declaration of how this interaction was going to resolve. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. There are other guests waiting." There were no other guests waiting at the front desk. Patrick looked up from the welcome packets. He looked at Elijah, at the stillness of him, the wallet on the counter, the expression that hadn't changed. He looked at Vanessa, at the set of her jaw, the angle of her chin, the way she was holding herself in this moment like someone who had made a decision and intended to stand in it. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and looked back down at the folders he hadn't moved. Elijah did not move immediately. He stayed at the counter for a long moment, looking at Vanessa, not with indignation, not with the pained pride she might have expected or relied upon to conclude the interaction cleanly. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they want to understand rather than react to. Then he looked past her, at the configuration of the desk, at the screen layout, at the positions of the staff stationed behind the counter. He looked at the sight lines from the front desk to the lobby floor, at the elevator indicators above the bank to the left, at the administrative doors tucked along the far wall, at the space above the main staircase where a painting hung that had not been there before. He was reading the room, all of it, everything. He reached out. I picked up the wallet, returned it to his jacket pocket with the same unhurried care with which he had placed it, and stepped back from the counter. He didn't leave. He didn't argue. He simply turned, crossed the marble floor at the same measured pace, and settled himself into one of the upholstered chairs near the center of the lobby. He sat down, folded his hands in his lap, crossed one ankle over the other, and looked around the room. From the chair, Elijah Carter could see nearly everything. The Alderton Grand's lobby had been arranged with a spatial logic that was deliberate and calculated, and, in significant part, his, not in the sense of his name on anything. He had been careful about that from the beginning, but he had been part of the conversation that shaped this space, the sight lines from the front desk, the placement of the seating clusters to encourage guest flow without crowding the main thoroughfares, the relationship between the entrance and the elevator banks that had gone through 4 revisions before Howard Webb finally got it right. 3 consecutive evenings of blueprints spread across a work table, coffee going cold while they talked. That had been decades ago. He looked at the lobby now, and he recognized it. The way you recognize someone after a very long absence. When the face is right, but something in the expression has shifted, and you can't immediately say what it is, only that it has. A large potted fig tree stood in the corner near the east column. It hadn't been there before. The overhead lighting in the seating area had been adjusted, warmer than he'd specified, more atmospheric. It designed to feel intimate in a way that served a certain kind of guest experience while flattening the space for everyone else. The carpet runner that had once covered the corridor leading to the restaurant had been replaced with the same marble as the main floor. Cleaner, yes, but it changed the acoustic quality of that whole wing in a way that would never appear in a complaint log, but would register somewhere below consciousness on every guest who walked it. The painting above the staircase was a large abstract piece in golden gray, expensive, anonymous, designed to suggest culture without committing to any particular expression of it. It was the painting that bothered him most, not because it was ugly, because it was chosen by someone who was decorating rather than building, and there was a difference that mattered enormously over time. He looked at the front desk. Vanessa had returned to her screen, her posture straightened, her expression reset to professional neutrality. She did not look over at him. She had filed the interaction wherever she put things she was done with, and she had moved on. He looked at the bell station near the entrance. 3 bellhops on duty. The arrangement between them was unspoken, but legible. 1 near the door, 1 near the luggage area, and 1 at the edge of the station, with the posture of someone who had nothing to do and hadn't been told to do anything different. That 3rd one was watching the lobby, not with boredom, but with the kind of attentive discomfort that settles into someone who has witnessed something they can't quite put down. He was young, 23, maybe younger, lean and medium height, his uniform a size too big at the shoulders, the collar sitting slightly loose. He had an open face, the kind that hasn't yet learned to keep itself still. After a few minutes, he crossed the lobby and came to a stop near the chair. "Sir," he said quietly enough that the words were for Elijah and no one else. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened up there." Elijah looked at him. "Sit down if you want," he said, nodding at the adjacent chair. The young man glanced back toward the bell station, then at the front desk, then sat, perching at the forward edge of the cushion, the way you sit when you're not sure you're supposed to be there and want to be able to stand again quickly. "Marcus," he said, "Marcus Webb." "Elijah." They sat quietly for a moment. Across the lobby, a guest in an expensive coat was having a warm, easy exchange with the concierge, who was leaning forward with the full and bright attention of someone who meant it. It was the same warmth that had been entirely absent from the front desk 20 minutes earlier. "She do that often?" Elijah asked. He was still watching the lobby, not Marcus. "It's not just her," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. "It's more like the temperature of the whole place now. There's an unwritten way of reading guests. Who gets the real welcome and who gets redirected. Nobody talks about it out loud. You don't get trained on it directly. But you pick it up fast because you watch how the people above you behave and you understand what's expected." He paused. It wasn't like this before. The people who've been here longer than me say it changed when the new management came in, about 8 months ago. Who's managing now? Man named Hale, Richard Hale. He came from a different kind of property, the type of place where everything gets measured in revenue metrics, occupancy ratios, how efficiently you move guests through. He doesn't run a hotel the way you'd run a hotel if you actually cared about what a hotel is supposed to be. He runs it like he's tightening a budget and the guests are line items. Marcus caught himself. Sorry, I know that sounds... Keep going, Elijah said. Marcus exhaled. He talks about the guest experience in terms of value tiers. He's never said that directly in front of me, but that's the idea underneath everything. Some guests get the full attention, some get the polished brush off. And the staff learns which is which by watching who Hale pays attention to when he walks through. Elijah nodded slowly. He was watching the lobby as Marcus talked, watching the way 2 different guests were handled at the concierge station. One, a woman in a practical coat with sensible shoes, receiving polite efficiency. The other, a man whose tailoring announced his income without effort, receiving genuine engagement, a leaning in, a quality of attention that wasn't performed so much as activated. There's a woman named Faye in housekeeping, Marcus continued. She's been here 16 years, knows every floor, knows the preferences of repeat guests by name, knows which rooms have the drafts, and which elevators run slow. She's been written up twice in the last 3 months. Both for things that never would have been a problem before, moving too slow on a turnover during a high occupancy block, taking a few extra minutes to talk with a guest in a hallway. 16 years, and she's getting written up for being the kind of person who made this hotel worth coming back to. Elijah was quiet for a moment. The kitchen? He asked. Marcus looked over at him. The question was specific in a way that caught him slightly off guard. The kind of detail that suggests the person asking has a broader picture of how a hotel actually functions than most guests would. High turnover since Hale came in. The chef they had before, I never worked with him, he was gone before I started, but people talk about him the way they talk about something good that got taken away before they quite understood how good it was. The one they have now runs a tight cost operation. Food costs, waste percentages, labor efficiency, he runs it clean on paper. But the energy in that kitchen is tired. You can tell when you pick up room service deliveries. The food comes out fine, but fine is not what this place was supposed to be. Elijah nodded. He had heard enough, but he didn't stop listening. He let Marcus talk because Marcus was telling him the truth, and people who told the truth deserved to be heard. Across the lobby, a new arrival had come through the main entrance, a man in a very good suit, moving with the comfortable authority of someone who travels often and expects things to go smoothly. Behind him, a woman in a long coat. And behind her, a porter managing 4 matching pieces of luggage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been thoroughly tipped before the car left the airport. The energy around the front desk changed instantly. Vanessa moved. Daniel moved. 2 staff members who had been hovering at the periphery converged toward the desk with coordinated focus, and suddenly the lobby was alive in a way it hadn't been for the last half hour. Whitmore, Marcus said, without being asked. He's here every 2 or 3 weeks. Corporate account. Hale makes sure someone's always there to meet him. First night's restaurant tab is comped. Suite guaranteed. Car service goes through the hotel account. He paused. Those things exist for a reason. But Whitmore doesn't get that treatment because he's been a loyal guest over many years. He gets it because of how he walked in the first time. That was the signal, and once it was given, everything followed from it. Elijah said nothing. He watched Whitmore move through the lobby, relaxed, unhurried, comfortable in his own belonging, and watched the staff rearrange themselves around him with a choreographed ease that spoke of repetition, of a pattern so established it had stopped feeling like a choice. Then the administrative doors on the far side of the lobby opened, and Richard Hale walked out. He was tall and broad, mid-50s, carrying the settled density of someone who had once been physically capable and had traded that quality over time for a kind of institutional gravity. His suit was well made but practical. His expression was the expression of a man who managed things, controlled, assessing, not unkind exactly, but not particularly interested in warmth either. He moved through the lobby the way a landlord moves through a building he owns, scanning, accounting, adjusting his internal ledger of how things were running. His scan reached Elijah. He crossed the lobby with deliberate, measured steps and stopped a respectful distance from the chair, positioning himself in the stance of a man offering courtesy while also being clear about its limits. "Good afternoon," he said. "I understand there was some confusion at the front desk earlier. Is there something I can help you with?" Marcus had stood the moment Hale emerged from the offices and taken a careful half-step back. He stood just at the edge of the conversation now, doing everything he could to be invisible. "No confusion," Elijah said. "I requested the presidential suite." The clerk declined to process the request. Hale's expression shifted in a way he probably wasn't aware of, a brief tightening that resolved almost immediately back into composure. "Our team is trained to match guests with accommodations that are the right fit for their stay," he said. "I'm certain the intention was to be helpful. These things can sometimes come across a bit differently than intended." He paused. "Is there another way I can assist you? There are several very comfortable properties in the area that might—" "No," Elijah said. "Thank you." Hale let the pause sit between them for a moment. The pause of a man waiting for a conversation to end the way he had already decided it was going to end. When Elijah offered nothing further, Hale gave a short, conclusive nod. "Of course. Enjoy your afternoon." He looked at Marcus, not long, not overtly, but the message was clear, and walked back toward the administrative doors. They closed behind him. Marcus stood still for a moment, then exhaled. "I should get back," he said. "They'll notice." "Go on," Elijah said. Marcus took a step toward the bell station, then stopped. He turned around and looked at Elijah with the honest directness of someone who has decided to say the thing they're actually thinking. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah looked at him. "Why are you still here?" It was a genuine question, not a challenge. The kind of thing someone asks when a situation doesn't resolve into any of the shapes they know. And the only way forward is to ask directly. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he looked around the lobby at the chandelier that was the original chandelier, at the staircase that was the original staircase, at the marble floor with its particular veining that Howard Webb had chosen over 3 alternatives and that Elijah had agreed to after sitting with the samples for a long, unhurried hour. At the administrative doors behind which a man named Hale was running something that had once been built with care into something that ran efficiently and meant nothing. At the painting above the staircase that someone had hung without understanding what they were replacing. "Because I'm not finished," he said. Marcus looked at him the way you look at something that is only beginning to become visible for what it actually is. Then he nodded, slowly, as if the answer had told him something, even though he couldn't yet say what, and walked back across the marble floor to the bell station. Elijah sat for a little while longer. He let his eyes move through the space methodically, carefully, the way you walk through something important before a long absence to take account of where everything is, so you know what will need to be found and fixed and restored. The bones were intact. The bones were still good. Everything built around them was going to have to change. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone, found a number he had not called in some time, pressed it, and raised the phone to his ear. It rang twice. "It's me," he said when the line opened. He listened. "No," he said quietly. "I've seen enough. Start the process." He ended the call. Returned the phone to his pocket with the same deliberate care he gave to everything. sat for one last moment in the lobby of the Alderton Grand Hotel, in the chair closest to the center, where he could see all of it. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked back out into the rain. The Beaumont Inn sat directly across the street from the Alderton Grand, separated by 4 lanes of city traffic and about 40 years of ambition. It was a modest property, clean, functional, the kind of place that changed its lobby flowers once a week and kept its carpets vacuumed, but made no claims beyond comfort and a fair rate. The kind of place nobody wrote about in travel magazines. Elijah checked in that same evening. The clerk at the Beaumont's front desk was a heavy-set man in his late 50s named Gerald, who processed the room request without ceremony, asked if Elijah needed help with bags, and when Elijah said no, handed over a key card and told him the elevator was to the right and breakfast started at 7. That was the full extent of it. No assessment, no calibration, just a room and a key card. Elijah rode the elevator to the 4th floor, found his room, and set his small travel bag on the luggage rack near the window. The room was plain and well kept. He pulled a chair to the window, sat down, and looked across the street. The Alderton Grand was lit up against the evening, warm gold through its tall windows, the canopy illuminated from above, the steady movement of taxis and town cars along the curb below. From this distance and this angle, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a grand hotel, running smoothly in the evening hours, everything in order, everything correct. But Elijah had spent enough time in enough institutions to know that what a building looked like from across the street told you almost nothing about what was happening inside it. He opened a small notebook, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket, its cover soft from handling, the spine creased and rebent so many times it had gone permanently supple. He uncapped a pen and began to write. He wrote what he had seen at the front desk. The exact language Vanessa had used, in the order she had used it, and the language Hale had used after her. The particular way each of them had framed a dismissal as something other than what it was. Vanessa's had been delivered as a practical service, as if she were sparing him embarrassment. Hale's had arrived wrapped in operational vocabulary in the language of matching and fit and appropriate accommodation, which was a more sophisticated way of doing the same thing and in some ways more damaging because it was harder to see clearly. He wrote what Marcus had told him. The unwritten training by observation, Faye in housekeeping with her 16 years and her 2 recent write-ups, the kitchen's flattened energy, Whitmore's preferential treatment extended not on the basis of loyalty, but on the basis of appearance. He wrote about the changed lighting, the replaced carpet runner in the restaurant corridor, the painting above the staircase that someone had chosen to hang without understanding what they were choosing to replace. He wrote about Patrick, the junior desk clerk who had stood 3 feet from what was happening and not said a word. He noted that Patrick's silence was not simply cowardice, it was the kind of conflict that develops in people who work inside broken systems before they have accumulated enough standing or enough certainty to push back against them. That kind of silence was its own data point. It told you something about what the people above Patrick had built and what they had made possible. He wrote for nearly an hour, filling 6 pages in his small, steady hand. Then he set the notebook down on the windowsill, looked at the hotel across the street, and thought about something that had happened a very long time ago. He had been in his late 30s when the idea for the Alderton Grand had taken its first real shape. And the financing had been complex, deliberately so. He had structured his ownership through a layered trust arrangement, the details of which existed only in legal documents held by 2 attorneys, one of whom had since retired, and one of whom still practiced. The trust held the controlling stake. The trust was managed by a holding company. The holding company had a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know where to look. Elijah had designed it that way precisely because he had wanted to know whether a hotel could hold its founding values without knowing who was watching. For a long time it had. He had made quiet visits over the years, never announced, never in any official capacity, always dressed the same way he dressed on any ordinary Tuesday. He had eaten in the restaurant. He had sat in the lobby. He had watched. And for a long time, what he had seen was a hotel that treated people decently, that understood hospitality as something more than a transaction, that had maintained the particular quality of dignity he had wanted it to carry from the beginning. Somewhere in the last few years, that had begun to change. He had seen the early signs from a distance, in financial reports, in occupancy analyses, in the slow drift of certain metrics that pointed toward a management philosophy he didn't recognize. That was why he had come in person. That was why he had come the way he came. Now he knew it was worse than the numbers had suggested. He opened his phone and sent a short message to an address that belonged to a woman named Diane Forrester, who was a senior compliance associate at the firm that managed the holding company. The message said simply, "Initiate full audit. All departments. Beginning of next week." He added, "Discreet," and then, "I'll be nearby." He set the phone down and looked out the window. Across the street, the Alderton Grand went on being beautiful. Inside the hotel, things were already shifting in ways that hadn't yet reached the surface. The email arrived in Richard Hale's inbox at 11:47 that same night, while he was still in his office reviewing the week's occupancy projections. It came from an address he recognized, a corporate communications channel he had used a handful of times for routine procedural matters. But the tone of it was different from anything he'd received before. It informed him that the hotel would be subject to a scheduled internal review beginning the following Monday, covering operations, human resources practices, financial reporting, and guest experience protocols. The review was described as routine. The word routine appeared twice in 2 different paragraphs in a way that did not feel routine. He read it 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and tried to reconstruct the last several weeks for anything that might have triggered a corporate-level inquiry. He thought about the Q3 numbers, which were strong. He thought about the staffing changes he'd made in the restaurant, which had been handled cleanly on paper. He thought about the 2 guest complaint forms that had been submitted in the last month, both of which he had resolved through standard protocol. He did not think about Elijah Carter. He forwarded the email to his assistant with a note to schedule a department meeting for first thing Monday morning, then closed his laptop and went home. In the lobby, at the Bell station, Marcus Webb was finishing the last hour of his evening shift. A different set of bellhops had cycled in for the night crew, and Marcus was collecting his things from the small break room behind the luggage area when he noticed the change in energy. Not something he could point to directly, but the way a shift sometimes has a different texture than the one before it, a particular kind of tightness. One of the night managers was on the phone, his voice low and compressed, standing in the corridor outside the administrative offices with his back to the lobby. Marcus didn't stop. He changed out of his work shoes, put on his jacket, and then walked out through the staff entrance into the cool night air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the building. Then he looked across the street at the Beaumont Inn and thought, without quite knowing why, about the old man who had sat in the lobby chair all afternoon as if he owned the place. Vanessa Holt arrived for her morning shift the next day in the particular mood of someone who had fully dismissed an unpleasant experience and was ready to begin fresh. She bought coffee from the cart on the corner, changed into her uniform in the staff locker room, and arrived at the front desk at 8:57, 3 minutes early, which was her custom. She chatted briefly with Daniel about the occupancy count for the day, noted that there were 3 checkouts before noon and 2 early arrivals expected, and settled into her station with the comfortable efficiency of someone in command of their routine. She did not think about the old man with the worn jacket. The incident had closed for her the moment he walked out the door. By 10 in the morning, she noticed that Daniel seemed distracted. He was checking something on his secondary screen with more frequency than usual, and twice she caught him looking toward the administrative offices with the expression of someone waiting for news they're not sure they want. "What is it?" she asked when the lobby was briefly quiet. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause, "Did you hear about the review?" She hadn't. He told her what he'd heard, secondhand, from one of the night managers, passed along at shift changeover. Corporate review, beginning Monday. All departments. He didn't know more than that. Vanessa held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the lobby for a moment. "That happens," she said. "It's quarterly stuff. It's nothing." Daniel nodded but didn't look convinced. Vanessa turned back to her screen. She filed the information in the same place she filed most things that didn't require immediate action, and she went on with her morning. The auditors arrived Thursday. There were 3 of them, 2 women and a man, all in their 30s, all carrying the kind of quiet professional authority that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. They checked in through the administrative entrance and were shown to a conference room on the 2nd floor that was normally used for small corporate meetings. They brought their own laptops. They asked for access to the hotel's internal systems, or its guest log archives going back 3 years, its HR file records, and its financial reports broken down by department and quarter. The request went through Hale's office. He approved it because he had no standing to refuse it, but he spent the rest of that day at his desk in a state of controlled alertness, his expression unchanging to anyone who looked, the quality of his attention bent inward on something he wasn't sharing with anyone. By Friday afternoon, the auditors had been given access to everything they asked for. One of them had asked, almost casually, whether the hotel maintained a record of guest complaints that had been escalated and then resolved internally rather than formally logged. It was a specific question. Hale's assistant had said she would have to check and get back to them. She had not yet gotten back to them. Marcus noticed the auditors on Thursday evening when he carried a set of luggage past the 2nd floor conference room and saw through the glass panel in the door that the lights were on and 3 people were seated at the long table with laptops open and papers spread between them. He had not been told anything official. He pieced it together from what he saw, the way you piece things together when the people above you have decided information should travel selectively. He thought again about the old man in the lobby chair. He thought about the phone call, the way Elijah had made it quietly, without standing up, without drama, without giving the slightest indication of what he was doing or who he was calling. He thought about the words he had heard from across the seating cluster, not the full sentence, or just the end of it. "I've seen enough." He thought about that for a long time. On Friday evening, as he was wiping down the luggage cart in the storage area before clocking out, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. "Marcus." The voice was calm, measured, immediately recognizable. "This is Elijah Carter. We spoke in the lobby on Tuesday." Marcus straightened. "Yes, sir." "They don't know who I am yet," Elijah said. "I want to keep it that way for a little while longer. But I want you to know that what's happening in that building right now is connected to what you told me. You told me the truth on Tuesday. I want to thank you for that." Marcus stood in the luggage storage room with one hand on the cart and said nothing for a moment. Then, Can I ask who you are? Well, actually." A pause on the line. Not hesitation, more like a man deciding how much of an answer was useful at this particular moment. "Someone who should have come back sooner," Elijah said. "Go home, get some rest. Things are going to change in that hotel, and you're going to want to be there when they do." He ended the call. Marcus stood in the storage room for a long time after that, looking at nothing, rearranging everything he thought he understood about the past 4 days. The email that went out to senior hotel staff on Sunday evening was brief and formally worded. It announced that a stakeholder meeting would be held in the main conference room on the 4th floor Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Attendance was mandatory for department heads. The agenda listed a single item: operational review, leadership briefing. Richard Hale read the email at home, poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, and spent the rest of the evening going through the hotel's Q3 financial summary on his laptop, looking for anything that might explain what was coming. The numbers were solid. Revenue was up 4% over the same quarter the previous year. Occupancy held strong. The food and beverage department had hit its cost reduction targets 3 months running. He went to bed telling himself the meeting was procedural. He didn't sleep well. Monday morning, he arrived at the hotel at 7:30, 90 minutes before his usual time, and walked the property floor by floor with the focused attention of a man preparing for an inspection. He noted a scuff on the baseboard outside the third-floor elevator. He noted that the floral arrangement at the concierge station had not been refreshed over the weekend. He sent 2 messages and made 1 call before he reached his office, and by 8:15 he had issued a quiet general directive to all staff on duty. Today, everything pristine. The energy on the floor shifted almost immediately. Housekeeping moved faster. The front desk stood straighter. Vanessa arrived and caught the temperature in the air before anyone said a word to her, and she spent the first 20 minutes of her shift doing nothing but looking at the lobby, trying to identify what had changed. Then Daniel said quietly that senior executives were coming in for the stakeholder meeting, and Vanessa understood the particular quality of the morning's tension. She stood at her station and managed the feeling that had begun to move through her like cold water. Slow, spreading, not quite named yet. She reviewed the previous week in her mind, examining it for anything that might be considered a problem. She thought about the guest complaint that had been flagged 2 weeks ago about a room billing error. She thought about the new check-in protocol she had implemented for the loyalty program on her own initiative, which Hale had approved verbally but never put in writing. She did not think about the old man with the worn jacket. Not yet. The executives arrived in a black town car at 9:45. There were 2 of them. A man named Thomas Graves, who held the title of Chief Operating Officer for the hotel group, and a woman named Claire Ashford, who served as the group's Senior Director of Asset Management. They were let in through the main entrance, which was the choice of someone who understood how entrances communicate, and they crossed the lobby with the composed certainty of people who had done this before in other hotels and knew exactly how the next few hours were going to go. Graves was 58, trim, silver-haired, with the economical movements of a man who had learned to make very little effort look like considerable authority. Ashford was in her mid-40s, precise in her dress and her expression, carrying a leather portfolio that she held at her side rather than in front of her. They were met at the elevator by Hale, who had positioned himself there 8 minutes early, and who extended his hand and said it was good to have them in the building and that the conference room was prepared. Graves shook his hand. His expression was pleasant and told nothing. Ashford said, "Good morning," and stepped past him into the elevator. Hale followed them in, pressed the button for the 4th floor, and spent the 12-second ride with his hands clasped in front of him, saying nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. On the ground floor, the lobby carried on. Vanessa processed 2 checkouts and 1 early arrival. She answered a phone inquiry about weekend rates. She straightened the brochure display beside the front desk twice, which was something she did when she needed to do something with her hands. She looked at the main entrance each time the doors opened. At 10:17, the doors opened and Elijah Carter walked in. He was dressed exactly the same as he had been on Tuesday, the charcoal jacket, the collared shirt, the dark trousers, the worn leather shoes still carrying the memory of last week's rain. He walked across the lobby at the same measured pace, with the same unhurried quality of movement, as if no time had passed and no particular event had occurred. Vanessa recognized him immediately. Her first response was a tightening in the chest. Not quite alarm, not quite embarrassment, but something in the space between them. She watched him cross the lobby and felt, with a clarity she couldn't fully explain, that the morning's tension and this man's arrival were connected, even though she didn't yet have the information to understand how. He did not come to the front desk. He moved to the seating area, the same cluster of upholstered chairs, the same position near the center of the lobby, and sat down. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked around the room with the same quiet, evaluating attention he had carried on Tuesday, as if he was continuing something rather than starting something new. Daniel leaned slightly toward Vanessa. "Isn't that—" "Yes," she said. They said nothing else. On the other side of the lobby, near the elevator bank, Marcus was waiting with a luggage cart for a checkout that was running late. He saw Elijah come in. He saw him cross the lobby and sit down. Something in his chest settled slightly, the way it settles when you've been waiting for a development that you couldn't name but knew was coming. He kept his face still and went back to waiting. At 10:43, the elevator doors opened and Thomas Graves and Claire Ashford stepped out into the lobby. They paused briefly just beyond the elevator, and Graves looked around the space with the assessing gaze of a man taking in a property he understood on a level most people in the room did not. He looked toward the seating area. He looked at Elijah. He said something to Ashford, who nodded once, and then they both walked directly across the lobby toward the chairs where Elijah was seated. The lobby didn't stop. It continued around them. The front desk operating, a guest moving toward the concierge station, the soft sound of the elevator indicators counting floors. But something had altered. The space seemed to compress slightly, the way it does when attention has located its true center. Graves stopped in front of Elijah's chair and extended his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, "it's good to see you, sir. We came as soon as you were ready." Vanessa heard it. She was not standing close enough to catch every word, but she heard the name and she heard the register of it. Not the polished warmth of a staff member greeting a preferred guest, but the specific, grounded respect of someone speaking to a person of genuine authority. The kind of register that has weight behind it. She went very still at her station. Daniel had heard it too. He was looking at the scene across the lobby with the expression of someone whose brain is working faster than his face. Elijah rose from the chair without hurry and shook Graves's hand. He nodded to Ashford. He looked briefly around the lobby, taking one more pass over its details, the chandelier, the staircase, the floor, the painting. And then he looked toward the front desk. He found Vanessa's eyes. She was looking directly at him, and this time she could not look away. Something in the recognition of the moment had nailed her in place, and she stood at her station with both hands flat on the counter and felt the pieces assembling themselves in her mind one by one, each one worse than the last. He held her gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with the pointed satisfaction of someone whose moment had arrived. He looked at her with something quieter and harder to bear than either of those things, a calm, steady disappointment. The kind that comes from someone who expected more and is now simply noting with care that they didn't get it. Then he turned back to Graves and Ashford. "Shall we?" he said. They walked together toward the elevator. Hale, who had appeared from the direction of the administrative corridor and had been standing near the far wall processing what he was seeing, fell into step a beat behind them, not because he was invited, but because he couldn't think of what else to do. The elevator doors closed. The lobby resumed its regular sounds. Vanessa became aware, slowly, that she hadn't moved in almost a minute. She became aware of Daniel beside her, also still, his hands resting flat on the desk in front of him in a posture that mirrored her own. She became aware of Marcus across the lobby, standing at the luggage cart with his hand on the handlebar, watching the elevator doors with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. Something between recognition and relief. She looked at the chair where the old man had been sitting. It was empty now. The cushion barely showed that anyone had been there. She thought about Tuesday, about the worn jacket and the old wallet placed so carefully on the counter, and the way he had said, "Just run the request." Not demanding, not angry, just clear, with that quality beneath it that she had not known what to do with. She thought about how she had told him in front of the lobby that she didn't think this hotel was within his budget. She thought about how the words had felt in the moment, reasonable, efficient, honest in the way she told herself she was being honest. She thought about the slight lift of her chin, of the small assertion of authority, the way she had positioned the conversation as something she was concluding for his benefit. She thought about what Thomas Graves had said. "Mr. Carter, it's good to see you, sir." The lobby moved around her. Guests crossed the marble floor. A phone rang at the concierge station. The soft chime of the elevator returned, empty now, to the ground floor. Vanessa set her coffee cup down on the counter behind her with careful precision, as if she didn't entirely trust her hands at that particular moment, and looked at the lobby without seeing any of it. Upstairs in the fourth-floor conference room, the door closed. Hale took his seat at the far end of the long table and spent a moment arranging the papers he had brought. The Q3 summary, the operations report, the staffing overview, ordering them in front of him with the careful composure of a man who understands that composure is currently all he has. Graves sat across from Elijah, and Ashford opened her portfolio. Elijah looked around the room once, then he looked at Hale. "Thank you for being here," he said. His voice was exactly the same voice he had used in the lobby on Tuesday, even unhurried, carrying something beneath it that made the room lean in. Hale said, "Of course," and straightened the papers in front of him. "Before we go through the audit findings," Elijah said, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about how this hotel is being run. Not the numbers, the decisions behind the numbers." He paused. "Starting with the guest experience policies implemented in the last 8 months. Hale's hand settled flat on the papers in front of him. He looked at Elijah Carter, at the charcoal jacket, the simple shirt, the worn hands resting calmly on the conference table, and he understood, with the full and sudden clarity of something that had been approaching for a long time without his having been willing to see it, that the man sitting across from him was not a corporate liaison, was not an external auditor, was not any of the categories his mind had been preparing for. He looked at Graves, who was watching him with a neutral expression that confirmed nothing and denied nothing. He looked back at Elijah. "I'd be happy to walk you through our operational approach," Hale said carefully. "We've made a number of strategic improvements since I came on board." "I know," Elijah said. He looked at the surface of the table for a moment, then back at Hale. "I've been watching this hotel for a very long time. That's what I'd like to talk about. The distance between what it was built to be and what it has become." The room was very quiet. Hale looked at the man across from him and did not, for the first time in the entire 8 months he had run the Alderton Grand, know what to say next. The conference room on the 4th floor had been designed for small corporate gatherings. A long oval table in pale ash wood, 8 leather chairs, a credenza along one wall with a water service, and a neat stack of branded notepads, and a window that looked out over the city's mid-morning rooftops. It was a room meant to feel neutral, functional, clean. The kind of room where the architecture tries to distribute authority evenly so that whoever is running the meeting can establish their own hierarchy from scratch. This morning, it felt like the inside of a held breath. Richard Hale sat at one end of the table with his operational reports arranged in front of him in the careful order of a man who had spent the weekend preparing. The Q3 summary was on top, then the staffing overview, then the guest experience metrics printout, then the facilities maintenance log. He had arranged them the night before and checked them again this morning, and they were very good numbers, most of them. The kind of numbers that told a story of a hotel performing well by the measures hotels are typically measured by. He had been relying on those numbers the way a person relies on a good coat in uncertain weather. Thomas Graves sat to Elijah's left, Ashford to his right. Both of them were open and composed in the specific way of people who already know the general shape of the conversation and are not afraid of where it is going. Hale had positioned himself across from Elijah with the instinct of someone who understood, arriving too late, that the position at a table was the only form of control still available to him. Elijah let the silence sit for a moment after the door closed. He did not open a folder. He did not consult notes. He looked at the surface of the table, the pale ash wood, the careful grain of it. And then he looked at Hale with the same unhurried, evaluating attention he had brought to everything since Tuesday afternoon. "Tell me about the Guest Experience Initiative," he said, "the one introduced in the spring." Hale straightened. "We refined our service model to better prioritize high-value guests. It was a competitive response to what other properties in the market were doing. Loyalty program members receive—" "That's not what I asked about." Elijah's voice was level. "I asked about the initiative, the internal training protocol, the one that taught your staff to sort guests by appearance before they reached the front desk." Hale's mouth opened and closed. "Our training program emphasizes guest recognition and—" "Richard." Graves said it quietly, without emphasis. Just the name. Hale stopped. "I've been in this lobby twice in the last week," Elijah said. "Same clothes, same wallet, same man. The first visit, your front desk clerk told me this hotel was outside my budget before I finished asking for a room. The second visit, your staff stood aside because two executives were present, and they understood in real time that the calculus had changed." He paused. "That's not an isolated incident. That's a trained response. And the training came from somewhere." Hale looked at his reports. "I understand that the interaction at the front desk fell short of our service standards. We take guest experience seriously, and I take full responsibility for—" "I'm not interested in the apology yet," Elijah said. "I'm interested in the system that made it possible. Walk me through the hiring changes since you came on board, specifically the departures, long tenure staff." Hale looked at Graves, who was writing something in the margin of a document without looking up. He looked back at Elijah. "We made some structural changes to align the team with the new performance standards." "Faye Drummond," Elijah said. 16 years, 2 write-ups in 3 months. For what specifically? A pause. Pace of service delivery during high occupancy periods, and a guest interaction in a corridor that extended beyond— "She was talking to a guest," Elijah said, "in a hallway for a few extra minutes, after 16 years of doing exactly what a hotel is supposed to do." He looked at Hale steadily. "How many long-tenure employees have left or been formally disciplined in the last 8 months?" Ashford slid a single sheet of paper across the table. She had printed it from the audit system that morning. Hale looked at it and said nothing. 14 names, 11 departures, 3 disciplinary actions. The shortest tenure among them was 6 years. "These are the people who remembered what this hotel was built to be," Elijah said quietly. "They're the institutional memory, and they were systematically made uncomfortable until they left or could be moved out." He let that settle. "That's not a staffing decision. That's the erasure of a culture." Hale was quiet. Graves cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, at this point, I think it would be useful to share what the audit has surfaced in terms of the financial records." Elijah nodded. Ashford opened her portfolio and turned to a tabbed section near the back. "In reviewing the hotel's vendor contracts over the last 18 months, the audit team identified a concentration of renovation and maintenance work awarded to a single external contractor, a company called Stratum Building Services. Over 8 months, Stratum has been paid approximately $340,000 in service fees." She turned the portfolio to face Hale. "The work orders on record for those payments do not correspond to any completed renovation visible in the property's physical state. The fourth-floor corridor refurbishment, which accounts for $62,000 of those fees, shows no material changes from the previous inspection. The mechanical systems upgrade billed at $88,000. We asked your facilities manager about it this morning. He said he wasn't aware of it. Hale had gone very still. Stratum Building Services, Elijah said, looking at him, is registered to a holding entity in Delaware. The beneficial owner of that entity, according to the incorporation documents the audit team pulled this morning, is a man named Gary Whitfield. He paused. Your brother-in-law. The room was quiet enough to hear the building's ventilation system. I want to be clear about something, Elijah said after a moment. I've owned this hotel for a long time. Quietly, through a structure that was designed to remain anonymous. The reason I built it that way, the reason I've maintained it that way across decades, is because I wanted to know what this hotel would be without me standing over it. I wanted to know if the values we embedded in its founding were strong enough to sustain themselves on their own. Whether the people who ran it would carry those values not because they were being watched, but because they understood what this place was supposed to mean. He looked at the table. For a long time they did. The people who ran this hotel held those values with care and intelligence. They treated every person who came through the front door as if that person mattered, regardless of what they were wearing, or what they arrived in, or how they spoke, or what they looked like. That was the founding principle. Not a mission statement. An actual practice, lived every day, maintained through every leadership transition over 30 years. He looked back at Hale. And then you arrived. Hale opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Elijah said quietly. There was no sharpness in it, just the clear, calm fact of the sentence. Hale closed his mouth. What you've done here isn't mismanagement. Mismanagement is carelessness. People making poor decisions without full information or without the skills the role requires. That happens in institutions, and it can be addressed. What you've done is different. You took a place that was built with a specific purpose, and you hollowed it out with intention. You pushed out the people who carried its character. 14 of them in 8 months, all of them with histories in this building that predated yours by years or decades. You replaced the culture they maintained with a hierarchy of visible wealth. You taught your staff, without a single written word, to treat human beings differently based on how they looked when they walked through the door. He paused. And while all of that was happening, you ran a financial scheme through the hotel's vendor contracts that put $340,000 into accounts connected to your family. He said all of it without raising his voice, without the weight that anger would have lent to it. He said it the way you state something that is simply, completely, irreversibly true. This is betrayal, he said, not of a corporation, not of a balance sheet, of something that was built to mean something by people who sacrificed real things to build it. Hale looked at the sheet with the 14 names. He looked at the portfolio open in front of Ashford. He looked at Elijah Carter, at the charcoal jacket, the plain shirt, the large hands resting flat and still on the ash table, and he did not say anything. Outside the window, the city went on at its ordinary pace. He indifferent to everything happening in this room. By noon, the auditors had moved from the second-floor conference room to Hale's office, which he had been asked to vacate for the afternoon. They were joined by a fourth person, a younger man named Patrick Olin from the group's legal team, who arrived with a hard drive, a printed chain of custody form, and the particular quiet focus of someone who had done this kind of work enough times to understand that drawing attention to it helped no one. The language around the process was careful. No one used the word investigation in front of the general staff. So the phrase circulating through the corridors and the break rooms and the low conversations happening at the back of the kitchen was internal review, accurate enough to be repeated without being specific enough to explain what was actually unfolding inside Hale's vacated office. The staff felt it anyway. There is a particular quality to a workplace when something is genuinely wrong at the top. a tightening of communication, a slowing of ordinary rhythms, a tendency for people to lower their voices in rooms where they would normally speak freely, to leave sentences incomplete, and let silence carry more than it usually has to. The Alderton Grand carried all of it by early afternoon. Housekeeping staff moved through their floors with a watchfulness that was different from their usual focused quiet, less assured, more expectant. The restaurant team ran the lunch service efficiently and almost entirely without conversation, which was unusual enough that the sous chef remarked on it to no one in particular and received no response. At the front desk, Vanessa processed her afternoon workload with the automated precision of someone operating on surface habit, while the rest of her attention had pulled somewhere else entirely. Daniel had stopped asking her what she thought was happening. He had tried twice that morning and received answers that were technically responses but contained nothing useful. He understood, without needing it stated, that she was not ready to talk about it and that pressing her further would not help either of them. He managed his half of the desk and let her be. Across the lobby, at the Bell station, Marcus moved luggage and opened doors and offered the standard courtesies of his role with a composure that required more effort than it usually did. He had known since the phone call Friday evening that something significant was coming. Now that it had arrived, in the form of auditors in Hale's office, executives on the 4th floor, and Elijah Carter sitting quietly at the center of all of it, Marcus found that the composure cost him more than he'd expected. Not because he was afraid of the outcome, because he cared deeply about how it went, and caring about things you cannot directly control carries its own particular weight. Elijah spent the early afternoon in the 2nd floor conference room with Graves, Ashford, and Patrick Olin, going through the audit findings methodically. They worked through the Stratum Building Services contracts item by item, the gap between the work invoiced and the work performed, the approval signatures on each purchase order, the pattern of timing that showed the first Stratum contract had been executed 11 days after Hale joined the property. 11 days. He had brought the scheme with him. There are 6 purchase orders with Hale's direct signature, Olin said, pulling up the scanned documents on his screen. The remaining 4 were approved through the facilities department, but 2 of those have a secondary sign-off from Hale in the comments field which establishes his oversight over those decisions. Elijah looked at the documents. What about the guest complaint logs? Olin pulled up a different section. The hotel's CRM system maintains a complaint record going back 5 years. In the 18 months prior to Hale's arrival, there were 12 formally logged guest complaints, all of which show resolution documentation. In the 8 months since his arrival, he paused. The system shows 4 formally logged complaints. But the audit pulled the front desk communication archives and found references to at least 31 guest complaints that were handled verbally and never entered into the system. Elijah looked at Graves. If it isn't logged, it doesn't exist in the record, Ashford said. Which means the hotel's guest satisfaction metrics look better than they are. Which means the performance reports Hale was sending to corporate looked better than they were. Which means the performance bonuses tied to those metrics were paid out on falsified data, Elijah said. Effectively, yes. He sat with that for a moment. $340,000 in fraudulent vendor payments, 31 unlogged complaints buried in communication archives, 14 long-tenure employees driven out, and underneath all of it, a culture of appearance-based discrimination quietly installed and maintained until it became the only way the hotel knew how to operate. I want to talk to some of the staff directly, he said. Not in here, not in a formal setting. Graves nodded. I'll arrange it. He started with the kitchen. The prep cook who sat down with him in the small staff dining room off the kitchen corridor was named Jerome, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the particular economy of movement that comes from working in tight physical spaces for many years. He had been at the Alderton Grand for 9 years. He had the hands of someone who worked with them seriously and the eyes of someone who didn't speak without thinking first. He looked at Elijah without visible nervousness, which Elijah respected. "Things changed about 8 months ago," Jerome said when asked. "Before that, this kitchen had something going on, not just technically. You can have high technical skill in a kitchen, and it can still feel like a dead room. This place had a pulse. Chef Marsden ran it that way on purpose. He used to say a kitchen either has a heartbeat or it doesn't, and once you lose it, you don't get it back easy. He meant it as a warning, I think. He was telling us to protect it." He looked at the table surface. "Chef Marsden left in February. The man they brought in after, he knows his food costs down to the decimal. He runs a tight sheet, very clean on paper, but he doesn't know that other thing, the heartbeat thing, and I don't think he'd recognize it if he stood next to it." "What happened to the rest of the kitchen team when Marsden left?" 3 people left with him. They'd worked under him for years at another property before he came here. They were loyal to him, and they went where he went. 2 more left by April. I stayed because I've got 9 years invested in this building, and I'm not walking away from that." He paused. "But I want you to understand what staying costs. You come in, you do the work, you do it well, and then you go home. There's nothing wrong with it. Technically, it just isn't what it was. And when you've experienced what it can be, doing adequate work in a place that used to be exceptional is its own kind of loss." Elijah thanked him, and Jerome went back to his kitchen. Next was Faye Drummond. She came in wearing her housekeeping uniform and sat across from Elijah with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight. She was in her late 50s with a composed, watchful quality, the kind of steadiness that develops in people who have spent a long time navigating situations designed to make them feel uncertain, and who have learned through practice not to let that uncertainty show. "I know who you are," she said, before he could introduce himself. Her voice was even and matter-of-fact. "Word travels in a hotel, always has, always will. It traveled today." "I know it does," Elijah said. "I'm glad you came in." "I almost didn't," she said, not with hostility, just honestly. "Not because of anything I know about you, because I've been in this building 16 years, and I've watched how these conversations tend to go. You sit down, you tell the truth to whoever is asking, and then a few months later you're still there, and the language around everything has changed slightly, but the actual conditions of your day haven't." "That's a fair concern," Elijah said. "Tell me what happened anyway." She looked at him steadily, measuring, deciding, and then she told him. She told him about the write-ups, which she had expected would be the first thing he asked about. But she also told him about the things that had never made it into any formal record. The way experienced housekeeping staff had been quietly pulled from the premium floors and replaced with newer workers, not because the newer workers were more skilled, but because they were less likely to notice when standards were being quietly reduced, and less likely to say anything if they did. She told him about the verbal instruction passed down through the housekeeping supervisors, never written, never documented, never traceable, that staff should minimize extended interaction with guests who appeared, in the supervisor's words, not to be the hotel's target demographic. "Everyone on the floor understood what it meant," Faye said. "Nobody had to explain it. You just knew. And when staff pushed back, they got managed out, quietly, carefully, in ways that could always be explained as performance issues. Tardiness on a turnover, a room not meeting inspection standard, things that happen sometimes and could be coached through, but instead became the beginning of a paper trail." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm one of the ones who's still here. I stayed because I kept thinking it would shift, that someone would notice, that the people above Hale would see what was happening and correct it. I stayed because I love this building and I wasn't willing to be driven out of it." She looked at Elijah directly. "Are you going to fix it?" Actually fix it, not just adjust it at the edges. Yes, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, measuring the answer against the man giving it. Then she nodded, a single, deliberate movement that carried the weight of someone who had learned not to accept reassurance easily and was choosing, carefully, to accept it now. "Okay," she said. "I believe you." She stood, smoothed the front of her uniform with both hands, and walked back out into the corridor without looking back. Marcus sat down last. He was still in his uniform, his shift technically still running, and he sat at the forward edge of the chair in the same way he had sat in the lobby chair on Tuesday, ready to stand again quickly if he needed to. Some habits take longer than others to ease. "You knew," Marcus said when he looked at Elijah. It wasn't a question or an accusation, just a statement of what he had been sitting with for the past several days, finally said aloud. "I suspected," Elijah said. "I came to make sure." Marcus looked at his hands for a moment. "The first time I saw you, when you were walking up to the desk, I noticed something. I couldn't have told you what it was then. Just that you moved through that lobby differently than most people do. Like the building wasn't something you were visiting. Like it was something you already understood." He shook his head slightly. "I thought I was imagining it." "You weren't imagining it," Elijah said. "Why come in the way you did? Why not just come in as the owner?" Elijah was quiet for a moment. "Because the owner arriving as the owner would have told me nothing useful. Everyone performs when they know who is watching. What I needed to see was what this hotel does when it believes no one of consequence is there." He looked at Marcus steadily. "And it showed me." Clearly and without ambiguity. Marcus nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the surface of the table. Then, "What happens now? To Vanessa? To the staff who just went along with things because that's how things were being run?" "That depends on who they are and what they chose," Elijah said. "The staff who simply followed a culture they were handed deserve understanding. They were working inside a system that was built above them, and navigating that system was their only available choice. Some of what happened in this hotel was not those people's fault." He paused. "But there's a difference between navigating a broken culture and building it, between following a bad instruction and inventing one. That distinction matters, and I intend to make it carefully." Marcus looked at him. "And Hale?" "Hale made his choices. Those have consequences that are beyond my discretion at this point." They sat in silence for a moment. Through the wall, faintly, the sounds of the hotel went on. The hum of the building's systems, a distant cart being moved down a corridor, the muffled sound of a conversation somewhere on the floor above. "You said something on the phone," Marcus said, "that I told you the truth when it would have been easier not to. I've been thinking about that. I didn't think of it as a brave thing at the time. I just couldn't not say something. It bothered me too much to stay quiet." "That's what integrity is," Elijah said simply. "It's not an abstract thing. It's what you do in a specific moment, in a specific lobby, when you've weighed the cost of speaking and decided to speak anyway." Marcus said nothing to that, but something in his expression settled, the way things settle when they finally find the ground they were looking for. After Marcus left, Elijah sat alone in the small room for a few minutes and listened to the hotel around him. The muted, living sounds of its afternoon, the building's quiet insistence on continuing even while the people who had damaged it were being held to account. It had always been like this, he thought. Buildings outlast the people who misuse them if the bones are good enough, and the Alderton Grand's bones were very good. He took out his notebook, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote, in his small, steady hand, the first notes toward what came next. The board meeting was held on Wednesday morning, 2 days after the auditors arrived and 1 day after Elijah finished his interviews with the staff. It took place in the same fourth-floor conference room, but the table was fuller now. Graves and Ashford on one side, Patrick Olin with his legal documentation on the other, and 3 additional members of the hotel group's senior board participating remotely through a screen at the end of the table. Elijah sat at the center in the same charcoal jacket with his notebook closed on the table in front of him. The morning light came through the conference room window at a low angle, laying a pale stripe across the ashwood table. Nobody commented on it. It was the kind of detail a room absorbed without needing anyone to name it. Olin presented the findings in the precise, measured language of someone who understood that every word spoken here would matter in subsequent legal proceedings. But he walked through the Stratum Building Services contracts, the approval signatures, the gap between invoiced work and completed work, and the beneficial ownership documents that traced the company back to Gary Whitfield, Richard Hale's brother-in-law. He presented the guest complaint suppression data, 31 unlogged complaints, the performance bonuses paid against falsified satisfaction metrics, the communication records demonstrating the suppression had been systematic rather than incidental. He presented the 14 names, the departures, the disciplinary actions, the tenure distribution, each line a small biography of someone the hotel had quietly discarded. When Olin finished, the room was quiet. Graves looked at the screen at the end of the table. One of the remote board members said that legal proceedings would need to follow the formal process. Another said that suspension was effective immediately pending outcome. The third said nothing, which in a room like this communicated its own kind of weight. Elijah looked at the door. "Bring him in," he said. Richard Hale walked into the conference room knowing, in the particular way that people know things they have been working to avoid knowing, that the shape of the next 10 minutes had already been decided without him. He sat down at the far end of the table in the chair Elijah had occupied during their first meeting, which was either coincidence or the room asserting its own geometry. Olin read the formal findings aloud. Hale's legal counsel, who had been called the night before and was participating by phone, he offered 2 brief procedural objections that Olin addressed without visible effort. Hale sat with his hands flat on the table and listened to his 8 months at the Alderton Grand be described in the language of documentation, which was colder and more absolute than any confrontation he might have prepared himself for. When Olin finished, Graves spoke. He said that Hale's employment was terminated effective immediately, that his access to all hotel systems had been revoked as of that morning, and that he was to surrender his key card and any company property before leaving the building. He said this in the same tone he might use to describe a change in catering arrangements, not because he was indifferent, but because authority, exercised cleanly, doesn't require performance. Hale looked at Elijah. He seemed, in that moment, to be searching for something, for anger perhaps, which would have been easier to meet than what he found. Elijah looked back at him with the same calm, settled attention he had carried through every moment of the past week, and said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. The documentation had said it. The room had said it. What Hale had built and what it had cost were now part of a record that would exist independently of anything either of them might say. Hale stood. He straightened his jacket with both hands, a small, precise gesture, the last exercise of the composure he had been maintaining all morning. He walked to the door. He did not look back. The door closed. Graves exhaled quietly. Ashford wrote something in her portfolio. The remote screen showed 3 faces that were already moving on to the next item. Elijah looked at the closed door for a moment, and then he looked at his notebook, and then he said, "Bring Vanessa in." She had been waiting in the small anteroom outside the conference room for 20 minutes, which was long enough to cycle through every version of what was about to happen and arrive, by the time the door opened, at a kind of exhausted stillness. She walked in and sat down across from Elijah. She looked different from Monday, not in any surface way. She was still precisely dressed, still composed, still professionally intact in the ways that training and habit maintain, even when everything underneath has shifted. But the particular quality of her composure had changed. On Monday, it had been the composure of someone certain of their position. Today, it was something harder earned and less comfortable, the composure of someone who had spent 2 days sitting with the full weight of what they had done and had decided somewhere in that process not to flee from it into defensiveness or justification. She had arrived at something more difficult and more honest than either. Graves and Ashford were present, but had moved to the far end of the table, leaving the space across from Elijah open and direct. He looked at her for a moment. "Why did you assume I didn't belong here?" he asked. It was a simple question. It had no legal weight, no procedural function. It was just the question underneath everything else, asked plainly. Vanessa looked at the table. Then she looked up at him. "Because of how you looked," she said. "Your jacket, your shoes, the way you walked in without luggage, without a car, without the accessories that this lobby is used to seeing. I made a calculation in about 30 seconds, and I acted on it." She paused. "And I was confident in it. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. I wasn't uncertain. I was sure." "Where does that sureness come from?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "From practice," she said finally. "From a year of being in a place where that kind of reading was rewarded, where moving quickly on a guest in either direction was treated as competence. I learned to do it because doing it well was what being good at my job looked like here." She stopped. "I know that's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. I'm just trying to answer your question honestly." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. "Do you understand what that practice costs? Not to the institution, to the person on the receiving end of it." She held his gaze. "I do now," she said. "I don't think I let myself understand it before. I sat in this hotel lobby for 2 days in the same jacket," he said. "I built this building. I poured 30 years of intent into what it was supposed to be. And the first thing it did when I walked through the door was tell me I didn't belong in it." He said it without anger. "That is what this kind of culture does. It doesn't just inconvenience people. It erases them. It says, your presence here is conditional on our approval of your appearance, and our approval of your appearance is based on criteria we have never made explicit and will never defend out loud." Vanessa said nothing. Her eyes were steady, but her jaw was set in the way of someone holding something together with effort. "I'm not going to terminate your employment today," Elijah said. She looked at him, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, because relief would have been too simple for what she was feeling, but something that was trying to become understanding. "I'm placing you on probation. 6 months, with mandatory training. Real training, not a checklist. You'll work under a guest relations mentor whose approach to hospitality is the one this hotel was founded on. You will be directly accountable to the new management I'm bringing in." He paused. "If you take that seriously, and if the people you serve over those 6 months are treated better because of what you learned here, then we can talk about what comes next." He looked at her steadily. "If you treat it as something to survive and move past, he will revisit the termination conversation." "I understand," she said. "I don't want you to understand it as a warning," he said. "I want you to understand it as a genuine opportunity. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him, at the worn jacket, the plain shirt, the man who had sat in her lobby and been dismissed with complete confidence by someone who should have known better. And she nodded, a real nod, something that cost her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with relief. Marcus Webb was not summoned to the conference room. Instead, Elijah found him at the Bell station at the end of the afternoon, during a quiet spell between arrivals. The lobby was in that particular late afternoon lull when the morning's checkouts have long been processed and the evening's check-ins haven't yet begun to arrive, and the building breathes for a few minutes without urgency. Elijah crossed the marble floor at his usual unhurried pace and stopped beside the station. He told Marcus directly, without ceremony or preamble, that he was being moved to a newly created guest relations role, the first of its kind at the Alderton Grand, designed as a connective position between guests and hotel leadership. A presence in the lobby that noticed things, responded to things, and held the standard of how every person who walked through the door was received and treated. Marcus listened carefully to the full description. Then he said, "I've been a bellhop for 3 months." "I know," Elijah said. "You spoke up on a Tuesday afternoon when it would have been considerably easier and safer to stay quiet and sort your welcome packets. That isn't a bellhop quality or a guest relations quality or any particular job quality. That's a character quality. Everything else that this role requires is trainable." Marcus looked around the lobby, at the chandelier, at the marble floor, at the staircase with its carved banisters, and then back at Elijah. He was sitting fully back in the chair behind the station, not at the forward edge the way he had been sitting since his first day. He hadn't registered the difference himself, but Elijah had, and he thought it was a good sign. "Okay," Marcus said. "Yes." "Good," Elijah said, and walked back through the lobby toward the administrative offices, where the work of rebuilding had already quietly begun. 4 months later, the Alderton Grand felt different. It was not a dramatic difference. Nothing had been torn out or rebuilt from scratch. The chandelier was the same. The marble floor was the same. The staircase, the columns, the skylight, all of it exactly as it had been designed decades ago by a man named Howard Webb and an investor who had preferred to remain unnamed. But the quality of the air inside the building had changed, the way air changes in a room when the people in it have changed, and the people at the Alderton Grand had changed in ways that mattered. Faye Drummond was back on the premium floors. She had not been officially reinstated to anything. The write-ups had been expunged from her record, and the restructuring that had displaced her had simply been reversed. Art without fanfare on the first Monday of the new management's arrival. She went back to her floors the way she had always gone, with attention and care and the accumulated knowledge of 16 years, and within 2 weeks the guests on those floors were leaving notes at the front desk that mentioned her by name. She didn't mention them to anyone, she just kept working. In the kitchen, something was returning that Jerome had stopped expecting to feel. The new executive chef, a woman named Sandra Oakes, who had spent 20 years in properties that understood food as hospitality rather than as a cost center, had been in the building for 6 weeks. In that time, she had introduced exactly 3 policy changes and had otherwise spent her time in the kitchen, cooking alongside the team, asking questions, listening to what the prep cooks and the line staff knew about the building and the guests it served. Jerome had watched her do this with the particular attention of someone who has been disappointed before and is deciding carefully how much to believe in a change. By the end of her 4th week, he had started arriving 8 minutes early. He hadn't done that in months. The initiative launched quietly in the hotel's 3rd month under new management. It had no grand name. Elijah had specifically declined the suggestion of a branded campaign, but its substance was real. A partnership with 3 community organizations in the surrounding neighborhoods, offering complimentary afternoon tea service once a month in the hotel's main dining room, open to anyone who wanted to come. The tea service was the same as what the hotel served to its paying guests. The tables were set the same way. The staff treated every person who came through the door exactly as they treated every other person who came through the door. The first afternoon, 14 people came. By the 3rd month, there was a waiting list. Graves had raised an eyebrow at the cost. Elijah had looked at him calmly and said that the cost of this initiative annually was less than what had been paid to Stratum Building Services in a single quarter for work that had never been done. Graves had looked at his papers and said nothing further on the subject. A journalist named Karen Bellows, who covered the hospitality industry for a business publication, had been tracking the story of the Alderton Grand's sudden leadership change since early in the process. She had good sources and good instincts, and by the third month she had most of the shape of it, the fraud, the termination, the audit, and was working on the part she couldn't quite confirm, which was the identity of the controlling stakeholder. She got a meeting with Thomas Graves, who confirmed the fraud findings, declined to discuss the financial specifics beyond what had already been disclosed in the legal proceedings, and when she asked about the ownership structure, referred her to the holding company's communications team, who referred her back to Graves. She wrote a good article. It covered the fraud, the cultural failures, the dismissal of long-tenure staff. It mentioned in its final paragraph that the hotel's controlling stakeholder had declined to be identified and had declined all interview requests. She published it. It was read widely in the industry. It generated 3 follow-up calls to Graves's office and 1 piece in a hotel trade publication. Elijah read it over breakfast at the Beaumont Inn, which he had continued to stay at because he liked the way Gerald handed over a key card without making it an event. He read it carefully, noted that Karen Bellows was a clear and precise writer, and set the paper down next to his coffee. He did not call anyone about it. There was nothing in it that required a response. On a Thursday afternoon in the 4th month, a man walked into the Alderton Grand's lobby. He was in his late 30s, in a work jacket and steel-toed boots, carrying a hard hat under one arm. And he had clearly come from a job site. There was a light dust on his sleeves, and he had the slightly compressed posture of someone who had been on their feet since 5 in the morning. He stood at the edge of the lobby and looked around with the mild uncertainty of a person who isn't sure they've come to the right place. Marcus Webb was crossing the lobby when he saw him. He changed direction without hesitation. "Good afternoon," he said, stopping near the man with a warmth that was not performed. "Welcome to the Alderton. Can I help you find something?" The man explained that he was waiting for his wife, who was attending a work function in the hotel's event space, and that he'd come straight from the job and wasn't sure if there was somewhere he could sit. "Absolutely," Marcus said. "Follow me." He led him to one of the upholstered chairs near the center of the lobby, the same cluster where Elijah had sat on 2 Tuesday afternoons, and asked if he could bring him something from the dining room while he waited. Coffee, tea, water, whatever he'd like. The man looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether the offer was genuine. Then he said coffee would be great, if it wasn't any trouble. Marcus brought him the coffee. He brought it in the same cup, at the same temperature, with the same care, as he would have brought it to Thomas Whitmore. Elijah watched the exchange from across the lobby. He had come in that afternoon to meet with the new general manager, a woman named Diane Wallace, who had been at the property for 3 weeks and was already asking the right questions. The meeting had run long in a good way, the kind of long that happens when 2 people are solving something real together, and he had emerged into the lobby in the late afternoon to find the light coming through the skylight at the angle it did in October, low and golden, catching the edges of the chandelier and the veining of the marble floor. He had stopped walking. He had watched Marcus cross the lobby toward the man in the work jacket, watched the brief exchange, watched Marcus lead him to the chair, and return with coffee. He watched it with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. Fully present, not performing anything, just watching a hotel do what a hotel was supposed to do. A small smile settled on his face. Not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction would have been too simple for what he was feeling. Something quieter and more durable. Or the feeling of a thing restored. He made a note in his notebook. 3 words. He would not have read them to anyone. They were for him. He had told Diane Wallace in their 3rd meeting that he was working on the structure of a new trust. one designed to embed the hotel's founding values into its governance in a way that couldn't be quietly eroded by a single management change or a run of good quarterly numbers. The trust would hold the same controlling stake. But it would also hold something else, a set of operating principles written in plain language that any future management would be contractually bound by. Not aspirational language. Specific, measurable commitments to guest treatment, regardless of appearance, to staff tenure and development, to community engagement, to financial transparency. Diane had read the draft principles and said they were good. She said they reminded her of why she had gone into hospitality in the first place, before 2 decades of working inside institutions that had slowly separated the practice from the purpose. Elijah had said he was glad to hear that, and meant it. He left the hotel that evening just before 6. The rain that had followed him in 4 months ago had long since moved on. The October evening was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that comes after a season has finished saying what it had to say. He buttoned his jacket, the same jacket, and walked down the stone steps to the sidewalk. He walked past the doorman, who held the door and said good evening with the simple, genuine courtesy of someone who had been told by the new general manager in that every person leaving this building should feel that their time here had mattered. Elijah said good evening back. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the Alderton Grand, at the canopy, at the warm gold light in its tall windows, at the city moving around it in the ordinary, indifferent way cities move, unbothered by the fact that something inside this particular building had been broken and repaired and was now, carefully and imperfectly and genuinely, becoming what it had always been intended to be. Then he turned, put his hands in his pockets, and walked into the evening like any other man. Unremarkable, unhurried, and exactly himself. How many times have we judged someone's worth by what they were wearing, and never once stopped to ask what they were carrying? If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.